Monte Cassino, Italy, January 1944. Private Tommy Sullivan from Detroit couldn't have known that discarded sea-ration cans, fishing line from his father's tackle box, and sheer desperation would create something military doctrine never anticipated. While officers laughed at his junkyard contraption, German intelligence intercepted American radio chatter dismissing it as hillbilly engineering. 3 nights later, 40 Wehrmacht soldiers advanced in absolute silence toward the American position. They never saw the trap. January 17th, 1944, 04:30 hours. Monte Cassino, Italy, private first class. Tommy Sullivan pressed his back against frozen Italian stone, watching his breath crystallize in air thick with cordite residue. The temperature hovered at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Artillery thunder rolled across the Leary Valley below like Detroit's River Rouge foundries, working triple shifts. Except here, the product was destruction. The ancient monastery perched above them wasn't just a landmark. It was a fortress the Germans had transformed into an observation post, commanding every Allied approach for 15 miles. Company B, 2nd Battalion, 34th Infantry Division, had been bleeding for 3 weeks, trying to take this godforsaken hill. Sullivan was 22 years old, a tool and die maker from Dearborn who'd assembled bomber parts at Willow Run before his draft notice arrived. Now he assembled corpses for burial detail. The mathematics were brutal. 43 men in his platoon 3 weeks ago. 21 remained. Every night, German patrols infiltrated American lines with surgical precision, throats cut, sentries vanished, ammunition dumps sabotaged. The enemy moved like ghosts through terrain they'd fortified for months. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, Stanford graduate, San Francisco native, second-generation Chinese-American who'd fought prejudice just to wear the uniform, crouched beside Sullivan in their sandbagged position. "We can't keep losing men like this," Chen said, voice hoarse from shouting commands over artillery. "Last night they got past 3 checkpoints, killed Kowalski and Martinez without firing a shot. We don't even hear them coming until it's too late." Sullivan studied the rocky approaches through the pre-dawn gloom. The problem was obvious to anyone who'd worked an assembly line where one weak point shut down production. "Sir, we're defending blind. No tripwires, no early warning. We're basically waiting for them to show up at our door." "Battalion says tripwires compromise our own patrols," Chen replied, frustration evident. "Besides, Germans know how to spot them. They've been fighting in these mountains since '43. The 34th Division, National Guard units from Minnesota, Iowa, and North Dakota, farm boys and factory workers, had been promised the Italian campaign would be swift. Instead, Monte Cassino had become a meat grinder. German General Heinrich von Vietinghoff's defensive line was masterfully constructed. Interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests in ancient stone structures, observation posts with perfect visibility. The Wehrmacht held every advantage: high ground, fortifications, intimate knowledge of terrain. American forces attacked uphill through mud and shrapnel, gaining yards at the cost of dozens of lives. Sullivan came from a family that believed problems existed to be solved. His father, Patrick Sullivan, had worked Ford's Highland Park plant, the original moving assembly line. "Can't make excuses, Tommy," his old man always said. "Find what's broken, fix it." That Motor City pragmatism, the belief that engineering and elbow grease could solve any problem, was baked into Sullivan's DNA. He spent that frozen morning scavenging. Other soldiers thought him crazy, picking through garbage dumps behind field kitchens, but Sullivan saw resources where others saw trash. Empty sea-ration cans, thousands of them discarded daily. Fishing line he'd carried from home in his father's battered tackle box, a good luck charm from Lake Erie perch fishing trips. Spent shell casings, bent nails. To Sullivan's assembly line-trained eye, these weren't refuse, they were components. By noon, Sullivan had sketched plans on the back of a field ration box using pencil stub. The concept was simple, almost embarrassingly so. Suspend tin cans on taut fishing line across likely German approach routes. cans filled with pebbles and shell fragments. When anyone tripped the line, even slightly, the cans would rattle, creating alarm. No electricity needed, no fancy equipment, just physics and desperation. When Sullivan presented his idea to Lieutenant Chen that afternoon, the response was skeptical at best. Captain Raymond Foster, their company commander, West Point graduate from Virginia, who'd commanded by the book, outright dismissed it. "Private, we're fighting the Wehrmacht, not defending a Tennessee moonshine still. We need real solutions, not Rube Goldberg machines." Sergeant Eddie Moretti from Brooklyn, a pre-war mechanic who'd rebuilt engines in his uncle's garage, was more diplomatic but equally doubtful. "Kid, I appreciate the initiative, but fishing line, tin cans. This isn't summer camp. Germans are professionals. They'll spot it, cut it, or just laugh at us." But Lieutenant Chen saw something others missed. Maybe it was his own experience fighting prejudice in the army. Being told Chinese Americans couldn't lead, couldn't be trusted, weren't real Americans. Maybe it was the fresh graves of men he'd commanded. Maybe it was desperation. "Let him try," Chen told Captain Foster. "We've lost 5 men this week to night infiltration. What do we lose by trying?" Foster's objection was immediate. Respect. Dignity. The moment Germans see we're defending ourselves with garbage, it'll hurt morale. "Sir, with respect," Sullivan interjected, channeling every ounce of Detroit's stubbornness. "I've spent 3 years building B-24 components. Precision work. This isn't garbage. It's a detection system using available materials. We're not fancy, but we don't need to be. We need to hear them before they hear us." The discussion was interrupted by incoming artillery, German 105mm shells screaming down from mountain positions, geysering frozen earth 50 yards from their position. Everyone dove for cover. When the barrage lifted, 7 minutes of hell that felt like hours, medics were already running toward wounded. Another 2 men from Company B wouldn't see Detroit, Brooklyn, or San Francisco again. That evening, Lieutenant Chen made his decision. "Sullivan, you've got 48 hours. Set up your system on the northeastern approach. That's where we've lost the most men. If it works, we expand it. If it doesn't..." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what failure meant. More body bags, more letters home to mothers in Dearborn and Minneapolis, explaining their sons died because command refused to try something unconventional. Sullivan worked through the night in 23-degree cold, with hands so numb he could barely feel the fishing line. He carefully mapped the rocky approach Germans favored, a winding path between boulders that offered cover from direct fire, but funneled attackers into a predictable corridor. Every 6 feet, he strung fishing line at ankle height, suspending sea-ration cans filled with gravel, shell fragments, and pebbles. The line was nearly invisible in darkness, thin as spider silk, but surprisingly strong, 20-pound test, meant for Lake Erie pike. The engineering was deliberate, cans suspended just high enough that wind wouldn't trigger false alarms, but low enough that even careful footsteps would disturb them. Sullivan created redundancy, multiple lines at different heights, ensuring one careful step might avoid the first trigger but hit the second. It wasn't sophisticated. It was American pragmatism at its finest, simple, cheap, effective. By dawn on January 19th, Sullivan had deployed 200 yards of perimeter coverage using 347 tin cans and every inch of fishing line he owned. He'd slept 90 minutes total, fueled by bitter coffee and the memory of Kowalski's funeral, a Minnesota farm kid who died silently with German knife in his ribs 3 nights prior. When other soldiers saw the installation in daylight, mockery was immediate. "Hey, Sullivan, you opening a hobo jungle?" one private called. Another, "What's next, scarecrows?" Even Sergeant Moretti shook his head. "Kid, I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, you'll never live this down." But Sullivan remembered his father's words from the Highland Park assembly line, "Don't matter if it's pretty, matters if it works." That night would provide the answer. January 19th, 1944, 2145 hours. Monte Cassino defensive perimeter. Moonless night, swallowed the mountain. Cloud cover blocked even starlight, perfect conditions for German infiltration. Sullivan crouched in his fighting position, hands wrapped around his M1 Garand, every nerve alive with tension. Lieutenant Chen had positioned 2 machine gun teams with overlapping fields of fire covering the tin can perimeter. 37 men of Company B's 2nd Platoon waited in absolute silence, breath misting in 20-degree cold. The waiting was torture. In Detroit, Sullivan had worked swing shifts at Willow Run, assembling B-24 fuselage sections in controlled environment. Bright lights, warm buildings, predictable routine. Here, work meant sitting in frozen mud, waiting for men to try killing you. His feet were numb in boots despite 2 pairs of wool socks. His fingers ached from gripping his rifle. The metallic taste of fear coated his mouth. Around 2300 hours, the mountain fell into unnatural silence. Artillery that had pounded positions all day ceased. Even wind died. Sullivan had learned this silence meant something terrible. Germans were moving. They coordinated their infiltrations with artillery pauses to maximize confusion, attacking when American defenders were exhausted, disoriented, and least alert. Lieutenant Chen moved between positions, whispering encouragement. "Stay sharp. Watch Sullivan's cans. First rattle, you illuminate and fire. Understood?" Men nodded, though several still exchanged skeptical glances. Betting against Sullivan's hillbilly alarm system had become camp entertainment. Most figured Germans would cut through it like warm butter. 17 hours. The first can rattled. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp metallic clatter that pierced silence like a Detroit factory whistle. Every American head snapped toward the northeastern approach. Sullivan's heart hammered. "There," he whispered urgently to Chen. 30 yards, 2 o'clock from the boulder cluster. Chen raised his hand, signaling machine gunners to ready. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then a second can rattled. Then a third. Not random wind, but sequential disturbance tracking left to right. Something was moving through the perimeter systematically. Suddenly, German voices hissed in darkness, sharp, angry confusion. The rattling had disoriented them. They'd expected silent approach, not noisy betrayal from unseen obstacles. One voice barked orders in German. "Was ist das? Draht? What is this? Wire?" Lieutenant Chen didn't hesitate. "Illuminate." Flares shot skyward from 2 positions simultaneously, bursting into artificial daylight that turned night into stark shadows. The scene revealed was nightmarish. 40 German soldiers, Fallschirmjäger paratroopers from the elite 1st Parachute Division, frozen in various positions throughout Sullivan's detection grid. They'd infiltrated as a full combat platoon, intending to overrun American positions, throats to be cut, chaos sown before anyone could respond. But Sullivan's cans had announced their presence while they were still tangled in the approach corridor, bunched together, completely exposed. "Fire!" Chen roared. Hell erupted. 2 .30-caliber Browning machine guns opened simultaneously, their distinctive heavy rhythm shredding night. Tracers carved red lines through darkness, impact rounds sparking off stone. Germans dove for cover, but the terrain that had seemed protective now became a trap. Boulders that concealed their approach now pinned them in a kill zone with no escape. Sullivan fired his M1, 8-round clip, emptying in seconds. The Garand's distinctive ping of ejecting clip was drowned by sustained machine gun fire. He reloaded with shaking hands, muscle memory from training taking over. 40 yards away, German soldiers scrambled desperately, some returning fire. Kar-98K rifles cracking, MP-40 submachine guns chattering, but they were fighting uphill against prepared positions with zero surprise. The engagement lasted 7 minutes, an eternity measured in heartbeats and muzzle flashes. When Lieutenant Chen finally called, "Cease fire," the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by ringing ears and moans of wounded. Flares still burned as Chen led a cautious patrol forward. Sullivan accompanied, rifle ready, stepping carefully through his own can perimeter. Many cans now shredded by gunfire, but having served their purpose. What they found was evidence of Sullivan's system's devastating effectiveness. 17 Germans dead, killed in the initial ambush, 12 wounded severely enough to be captured, men who'd received medical treatment per Geneva Convention before interrogation. The remaining 11 had retreated down the mountain, carrying wounded when possible, leaving behind equipment and intelligence documents. Among the captured was Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffmann, a veteran paratrooper from Hamburg who spoke adequate English. As medics treated his shoulder wound, Lieutenant Chen questioned him. "How did you plan to reach our positions?" Hoffmann grimaced. Pain evident, but professional soldiers' respect stronger. "We have infiltrated your lines 12 times in 3 weeks. Tonight was to be our largest assault. Kill officers, sabotage ammunition, retreat before response. Intelligence said you had no detection systems." He gestured weakly toward Sullivan's tin cans, several still hanging intact. "They said nothing about this. This is Private Sullivan's design," Chen said with undisguised pride. "Built from trash, your intelligence dismissed." Hoffmann looked at Sullivan with something approaching disbelief. "Tin cans. We were stopped by tin cans." Then, despite his wound, the German laughed. Bitter, exhausted laughter. "We study your military academy tactics, your doctrines, your regulations. Nobody warned us about American improvisation, about soldiers who refuse to follow the rules of how war should be fought." Sullivan felt surreal disconnection. He'd killed men tonight, men with families, hometowns, lives before war. But he'd also saved 37 Americans who would return to Detroit, Brooklyn, San Francisco, Minneapolis. There was no triumph in taking life, but profound relief in preserving it. Captain Foster arrived at dawn, surveying the scene with visible astonishment. The northeastern approach was littered with evidence. Expended brass casings, blood trails, captured German equipment, including detailed maps of American positions. And everywhere Sullivan's tin cans, dented, bullet-riddled, but vindicated. "Private Sullivan," Foster said formally, though his voice carried new respect, "I owe you an apology. You created a functioning detection system from literal garbage that stopped 40 elite German paratroopers. I was wrong to dismiss your idea." Sullivan's response was pure Detroit pragmatism. "Sir, it's just engineering applied to available resources. We had a problem. We lacked proper equipment, so we improvised. That's what Americans do. But the victory came at cost too. 2 Americans had been wounded in the firefight. Corporal Davis from Iowa took shrapnel to his leg. Private Hendricks from North Dakota caught a ricochet in his shoulder. Both would survive, evacuated to field hospital, but the reminder was stark. Even successful defense exacted price. Over the next 72 hours, word spread through the 34th Division like wildfire. Sullivan's tin can alarm became legend. Other companies requested his help installing similar systems. Sullivan spent sleepless days training soldiers in the technique, how to string line at proper tension, optimal can spacing, terrain analysis for likely approach routes. Within 1 week, Company B's sector went from 5 infiltrations weekly to 0. Germans adapted by avoiding American positions entirely, seeking softer targets elsewhere. The tin can perimeter became psychological weapon as much as physical one. German intelligence knew about it, warning patrols to expect unconventional American detection methods. But Sullivan understood something crucial that many missed. Innovation had a lifespan. Germans were already adapting, finding workarounds. The tin cans had bought time, saved lives, but they weren't magic. War was endless evolution. Measure and countermeasure, tactic and counter-tactic. January 28, 1944. German intelligence headquarters, Monte Cassino Abbey. Major Ernst Becker reviewed field reports with growing frustration that bordered on disbelief. As intelligence officer for German forces defending Monte Cassino, Becker prided himself on comprehensive understanding of enemy capabilities. He'd studied at the War Academy, analyzed American military doctrine extensively, predicted Allied tactics with 87% accuracy over the past 6 months. Yet the reports before him made no tactical sense. Hauptmann, Becker addressed his aide, Captain Werner Schmidt, explain again how Kampfgruppe Hoffmann failed. 40 men, elite paratroopers, planned infiltration, and they were detected by what exactly? Schmidt's expression was carefully neutral, the look of a professional delivering news his superior wouldn't want to hear. Sir, according to Unteroffizier Hoffmann's debriefing before capture, the Americans have deployed some form of acoustic detection grid, made from food containers and fishing line. Becker stared. Fishing line. Yes, sir, tin cans suspended on thin cord. When our men advanced, they triggered these contraptions, which made noise alerting American machine gunners. Our soldiers were caught completely exposed. The major's mind rebelled against the information. German military doctrine was sophisticated, refined through centuries of Prussian military tradition. They had studied American weaknesses extensively. Reliance on superior numbers, technological advantage, rigid adherence to field manuals. American forces were dangerous due to industrial capacity, but predictable in execution. They followed doctrine, established procedure, hierarchical approval chains. Yet somehow, American soldiers were defending positions using improvised alarm systems built from refuse. It violated everything Becker understood about modern warfare. This is not protocol, Becker said, as if stating the obvious would change reality. Detection systems require engineering core, formal installation, technical specifications. You don't create battlefield security from garbage. Schmidt hesitated before responding. Sir, with respect, perhaps that's precisely why it's effective. We anticipated conventional defenses, tripwires connected to flares, electronic sensors, regular patrol schedules. We trained to defeat those specific countermeasures. Nobody anticipated improvisation of this nature. Becker stood, pacing his command post within the ancient monastery. From these stone walls, German observers had perfect visibility of Allied positions below. They possessed every material advantage, superior position, fortified defenses, veteran troops. Yet increasingly, German infiltration operations were failing not due to American technological superiority, but because of creative problem-solving that military doctrine didn't account for. Intelligence intercepts painted a troubling picture. Radio communications between American units discussed Sullivan's system with growing enthusiasm. Other American positions were replicating the tin can detection grids. German patrols now reported encountering similar obstacles across the entire 34th Division sector. More troubling, American morale was improving. Intercepted letters home, censored but still revealing, showed soldiers writing about the Detroit mechanic who outsmarted German commandos with fishing tackle. The psychological impact was significant. American troops, previously demoralized by German night raids, now felt they possessed defensive advantage. Becker ordered countermeasures developed immediately. Sappers were instructed to advance slowly, cutting fishing line where detected. Patrols were equipped with wire cutters, trained to identify and disable the grids. Yet German commanders knew these adaptations came at cost. Slower infiltrations, increased exposure time, higher risk of detection even while disabling defenses. The fundamental problem was philosophical. German military effectiveness derived from discipline, adherence to proven doctrine, systematic execution. Americans approached warfare like they approached manufacturing: identify problem, improvise solution, iterate rapidly. There was no doctrinal answer to an enemy who refused to fight according to established rules. On February 2nd, German forces attempted another infiltration using new counter-tactics. A 10-man patrol equipped with wire cutters approached American positions under cover of artillery. They successfully identified and began cutting Sullivan's fishing line perimeter, methodical, professional, exactly per procedure. What they didn't anticipate, Sullivan had created redundant layers. The first line was deliberate sacrifice, designed to be found. Behind it, offset by 15 yards, was a second grid Germans didn't detect until too late. Again, tin cans rattled. Again, American machine guns opened fire from prepared positions. This time, 6 Germans died. 4 were captured. None escaped. Unteroffizier Hoffmann, still recovering in American custody, was interviewed again by military intelligence officers. His assessment was sobering. "You must understand, your military is not supposed to operate this way. We study your doctrine. It is rigid, hierarchical, predictable. But this Private Sullivan, he does not follow doctrine. He sees problem and creates solution without waiting for authorization from command structure. It's not military thinking. It's civilian innovation applied to warfare. We don't have training to counter that." The statement reached Lieutenant Chen, who shared it with Sullivan. The Detroit mechanic's response was characteristically modest. "Sir, I just did what any tool and die maker would do. Saw a manufacturing defect in our defense, engineered a fix using available materials. Guess Germans never worked an assembly line where you improvise solutions 50 times per shift." But Chen understood the deeper implication. American military strength wasn't just industrial capacity or technological edge, it was cultural. The same can-do optimism that had built transcontinental railroads, mass-produced automobiles, and erected skyscrapers was now being applied to battlefield problems. Soldiers from farms, factories, and workshops brought practical problem-solving skills that formal military academies couldn't teach. By mid-February, German intelligence assessments of American capabilities underwent significant revision. No longer were American forces considered merely technically proficient but doctrinally inflexible. New assessments warned, enemy demonstrates unexpected capacity for rapid tactical adaptation using improvised methods. Standard countermeasures may prove insufficient against forces that innovate faster than doctrine can accommodate. The tin can defense system had accomplished something no amount of artillery or frontal assault could. It had created doubt in German command about their own operational assumptions, and in warfare, doubt was a weapon as devastating as any explosive. April 1945, Washington, D.C. War Department. The war in Europe was ending. Hitler's Reich was collapsing under Allied pressure from all directions. Lieutenant Chen, now Captain Chen, after 2 promotions earned through repeated demonstrations of tactical excellence, sat in a Pentagon briefing room alongside 30 other officers selected for special assignment, post-war military doctrine review. The subject, lessons learned from the Italian campaign. When Monte Cassino finally fell in May 1944, after 4 brutal months, it had cost the Allies dearly, 55,000 casualties from all nations involved. The Germans had defended every meter with professional competence. Yet when military historians analyzed the campaign, certain patterns emerged that challenged conventional wisdom about modern warfare. Captain Chen was specifically invited to present on unconventional defensive measures employed by 34th Infantry Division. His 15-minute presentation focused on one case study, Private Sullivan's tin can detection system. The reaction from senior officers was mixed. Some saw validation of American ingenuity. Others saw dangerous precedent. Encouraging soldiers to improvise rather than follow established procedures could lead to chaos, they argued. But the statistics were undeniable. After implementation of Sullivan's system, infiltration casualties in 34th Division's sector dropped 73% within 2 weeks. The system had been replicated by British Commonwealth forces and even French units, each adapting the basic concept to local materials and terrain. More significantly, the psychological impact on German forces had been substantial. Post-war interrogations of captured German officers revealed that American improvised detection systems had forced changes in Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. German infiltration operations became more cautious, slower, less frequent, exactly the outcome desired. The tin cans hadn't stopped the war, but they'd saved hundreds of lives by making German operations costlier and more dangerous. Private Sullivan, now Sergeant Sullivan, decorated with Bronze Star for valor, had returned to civilian life in April 1945. He went home to Detroit, back to Willow Run, except now, instead of building bombers, he was converting the massive factory to peacetime automobile production. The skills that had created a battlefield defense system translated perfectly to post-war industrial challenges. Sullivan never sought publicity. When reporters asked about his famous tin can alarm, his response was typical. "I did what needed doing with what I had available. Any mechanic would have done the same." But Captain Chen knew better. Not every mechanic had the vision to see battlefield application for fishing tackle. Not every soldier had the confidence to propose unconventional solutions to officers who preferred orthodox methods. The lasting legacy of Sullivan's innovation appeared in unexpected places. Post-war Army training began incorporating field expedient solutions into combat engineering curriculum. Soldiers were taught not just to follow manuals, but to assess situations creatively, to improvise when standard equipment was unavailable. The concept that a private from Detroit could solve a tactical problem that had stumped command structure became teaching example at West Point. Initiative matters as much as rank. For Lieutenant Chen, now transitioning to civilian academic career, accepting professorship at Berkeley to teach engineering with focus on creative problem-solving, Sullivan's tin cans represented something profoundly American. In a nation built by immigrants, farmers, factory workers, and dreamers, the assumption was always that solutions existed if you looked hard enough and weren't afraid to break some rules. By 1950, declassified military reports detailed dozens of similar innovations from World War II. Improvised tank armor, welded by combat engineers, field-modified radios by Signal Corps technicians, emergency medical procedures developed by medics under fire. The common thread: American service members who saw problems as challenges to overcome rather than insurmountable obstacles. Sullivan himself rarely spoke about the war. When his son Patrick Jr. asked about his service in 1962, Sullivan's description was characteristically understated. "We had a problem with Germans sneaking up at night. I rigged some cans to make noise. Worked pretty well." He never mentioned the 17 German soldiers who died because of his invention, or the 37 Americans who lived because of it. Such calculations were too complex for simple conversation. But on November 11th each year, Veterans Day, Sullivan would visit the Detroit Memorial, where names were engraved of 34th Infantry Division soldiers who died at Monte Cassino. He'd stand before the marble tablets listing Kowalski, Martinez, and others, men who'd fallen before the tin can defense was implemented. He'd remember their faces, their voices, their hometowns, and he'd think about the fundamental randomness of war, how the presence or absence of a fishing line and some empty cans could mean the difference between someone going home or staying forever beneath Italian stone. Captain Chen visited Sullivan in Detroit in 1958, when Chen was writing a military history textbook. They met at a diner near River Rouge, drinking coffee and discussing lessons that transcended tactics. "You know what your real innovation was?" Chen asked. "It wasn't the cans. It was refusing to accept that we were helpless. Everyone else had resigned themselves to losing men. You refused to accept that as inevitable." Sullivan stirred his coffee, considering. "Sir Chen, I think Detroit taught me that every problem is solvable if you're willing to work it. My dad spent 30 years on assembly lines making things work that shouldn't have worked. That's what America does. We improvise, we adapt, we make it happen. Maybe that's our real advantage. We never learn to accept impossible." The conversation that afternoon touched on broader themes: how civilian skills had shaped military effectiveness, how democratic culture that encouraged individual initiative translated into tactical flexibility, how American optimism, sometimes dismissed as naivety, enabled approaches more rigid military cultures couldn't envision. By the time Chen's book was published in 1961, Sullivan's story occupied an entire chapter titled Innovation Under Fire, the Monte Cassino Improviser. Military academies worldwide used it as case study in creative problem-solving. Soviet military analysts studied it as example of Western military culture's unpredictability. British defense publications praised it as validation of Allied flexibility versus Axis rigidity. Thomas Patrick Sullivan died in 1982, age 60, from heart failure. His funeral in Detroit drew veterans from across the country, men who'd served in Company B, soldiers who'd survived because Germans couldn't infiltrate positions defended by tin cans and fishing line. Captain Chen delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite emotion. Tommy never thought of himself as hero. He was a mechanic, a problem solver, a man who saw what needed doing and did it. But that humility, that practical determination to find solutions, that's the spirit that won the war. Not just tanks and planes, but people like Tommy who refused to accept failure as inevitable. The lesson endured long after those who'd lived it had passed. In warfare, as in life, the most sophisticated solution isn't always the most effective. Sometimes victory belongs to those who refuse to surrender to conventional thinking, who see opportunity in adversity, who can transform trash into triumph. Monte Cassino eventually became peaceful historical site, the ancient monastery rebuilt. But in military archives, tactical training manuals, and memories of those who served, Sullivan's tin can alarm remained testament to American ingenuity, proof that courage, creativity, and a few empty cans could change the course of battles and save lives that might otherwise have been lost to darkness. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring the untold stories of World War II. The innovators, the improvisers, the everyday Americans who changed history without ever making headlines. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Private Sullivan's position? What unconventional solution would you try? Let's discuss in the comments below. And if you know a history buff or veteran who'd appreciate this story, share it with them. These stories matter. These heroes deserve remembrance. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the simplest solutions are the most revolutionary.